India, exploring a post-colonial multiplicity with Routledge, a work that underscores his expertise and innovative thinking. Today, we are honored to have you, sir. The session is over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Priyadharshini, and thanks SRM English Department, Chennai. I'm also part of SRM right now. Just joined SRM AP. So thanks to be part. I'm honored to be part of this program. I thought I only could listen to Pramod's lecture yesterday, and I think I will sort of start with certain questions that are left with that sessions. While during the presentation, there were some couple of questions which came as like, have we been already cyborgs or have been already post-human much before we recognize? Like, why are we recognizing as post-human only in this context? Especially when he talks about the deep time and the geological orientation of things. The question is quite natural to be asked whether we have been post-human before as well. I think that's a kind of a conceptual or a methodological question or an epistemological question. My presentation hinges on that aspect, and I will not be presenting anything on post-humanism directly, but what were the conceptual blockages, or what are the conceptual blockages that are being taken away by certain philosophical thinking which made the post-humanist position possible? So I'm not an advocate of post-humanism in that sense. I share sympathies with post-humanist positions, but what I'm gonna explore is the philosophical condition which made the post-humanist position possible. So, as it was noted, the major central problem for post-humanism is a notion of the subject, which is at the center. The last presentation was also about more than human. So human subject was or is at the center of post-humanist problematic. So while we are looking at it, the birth of the subject, if you look at the birth of the subject, it was a very painful birth in the history of philosophy with Descartes. It was mostly an epistemological subject, with the famous dictum you might be knowing that I think, therefore I am. It is kind of, even thinking was conceived in terms of a unity, a transcendental unity of the subject. But this proposition of subject, it was done by the modern philosophy, starting from Descartes onwards, which developed immensely by Immanuel Kant and Hegel and other people, which was radically being questioned in the phenomenological school, which is being radically questioned with the linguistic revolution that happened in the 1960s, especially with structuralism, starting with structuralism and post-structuralism. So in various ways, the unified subject were being questioned. So before that, two people who were quite central in questioning the unity of the subject was Nietzsche and Freud. All these sort of discourses which was around the linguistic modeling of the problematic, it was not a total erasure of the subject, but is sort of a subject, the constitution of the subject. What is the conditions of the possibility of the subject? That was their most important problematic. If you look at all these people, even though I would like to take Foucault as an example, because Michel Foucault is a person who kind of pronounced the death of the human in the order of things. And he has a reason. I will go in detail through that. Even though Foucault proposed the demise of the subject, the human subject, there was a subject which was anticipated in him always. His problematic was the constitution of the subject, or the subject at the margins, prisoner, madman, sexuality, all those things. Ideal philosophical subjects were fragmented into metaphors of institution in one way or the other. Whether it could be clinic, whether it could be prison, whether it could be madness or sexuality or whatever. So this is actually, this is in fact happening with Marx also. Marxian paradigm also steeped in sort of a subjective position. But this is not clearly an epistemological subject as Kant proposed or Descartes proposed, but a subject on which various force acts discursively, which are constituted in relation to different institutions. So these are a kind of what we can call a post-Kantian or a neo-Kantian subject, or what we call it as an institutionally located subjectivity. So in that sense, I would like to locate Foucault's revolution with the post-structuralist thought as solely a second French revolution. It radically didn't make any change as far as the subject's constitution is concerned, but it went to the margins wherein which what we call the infrahumans or the subhumans were present and looked at the constitution of that subjectivity. Althusser is another example. If you look at Althusser, Foucault and all those things, you can clearly see a Weberian strand there. Institution versus human. How institution kind of acquires human or produce human subjectivity in that sense. I'm not rejecting it, but it is all about, it can be considered as a kind of a second French revolution where liberty, equality, fraternity, which is being extended to another extreme, wherein which you have infra subjects, all these kind of subsurface subjects or tainted subjects comes into the picture and their constitution as well. Now, when it comes to Freud, he kind of completely fragmented the subject, but he has another problematic. He also posited the fragmentation of the subject in a different structure constrained by the Oedipal triangle, or what Deleuze would call daddy, mummy, me. That's sort of an Oedipal triangle. So Oedipus becomes a metaphor of everything, as king becomes the metaphor of father, metaphorical. So Oedipal becomes a metaphorical an extension. It becomes a fascist scourge. So a differential philosophical position is slightly different from this. There is no subject as such. It is anticipated like this, right? So that is where Deleuze becomes slightly different from the differential philosophers of post-structuralist context, right? There is no such subject position anticipated over there. It is not the erasure of the subject, but it is about the transformation of the subject. Before I go into that, let me just philosophically explain, using Foucault's order of think, what are the problems, the philosophical problematic through which he pronounced the erasure of the human or the human subject, right? If you look at ordering of the knowledge, Foucauldian archaeological ordering of knowledge pertaining to the human sciences, the man emerged as an epistemic concern only in the modern episteme. And I would like to quote Foucault: man is quite a recent creature, a demiurge of knowledge, fabricated with its own hand less than 200 years ago. He has grown old so quickly as he had been waiting for thousands of years in darkness for that moment of illumination in which he could be known. This doesn't mean that the concept of human was not there before. Instead, there was no epistemological consciousness of man or human as such before. This means before the end of the 18th century, man did not exist any more than the potency of life, fecundity of labor, and the density of language. So it was in the modern episteme. There are three epistemes as far as Foucauldian archaeological ordering of knowledge concerns: Renaissance, classical, and modern. I'm not getting into the details of that ordering of knowledge. I will focus it there in the modern episteme, in which he kind of problematizes It is with the rise of biology, political economy, and language. Life, labor, and language, the three positivities which informed the constitution of the subject in human sciences. So I would like to quote Foucault again. If man's knowledge is finite, it is because he is trapped without the possibility of liberation within the positive contents of language, labor, and life. And inversely, if life, labor, and language may be posited in their positivity, it is because knowledge has finite forms. One of the basic problem that which even Immanuel Kant's proposition of if you think about his categorization between noumena and phenomena, wherein which he says noumenal knowledge is impossible. There is only phenomenal knowledge possible because of the finitude. Foucault analyzed it as kind of analytic of finitude, or death becomes an important factor, or in political economy, if you say that there is a geometrical progression of needs and an arithmetic progression of resources, so it clashes and it comes into a finitude and it becomes a crisis. And Ricardian answer to the crisis, it's called Ricardian pessimism, where Marx came in and kind of historicized the crisis in terms of what the crisis emerged as. So finitude is a concept which constitutes the archaeological ordering of knowledge in the modern episteme. So you can say that these limiting factors which constrain forms of knowledge also become fundamental criteria for the possibility of knowledge in the human sciences. That's an introduction. But when it comes to the philosophical discussion as in the modern episteme, what really happened? This epistemological configuration of human ran into some philosophical problems which question the validity of the human-centered approach. So Foucault, the emergence of man as an epistemological category is possible in the finite structure that precedes and molds him, that is life, labor, and language. In Kantian fashion, these limiting structures which precede the human become the conditions of the possibility of the human sciences to emerge in the modern episteme, facilitating the epistemological constitution of the human subject. Foucault terms this as the analytic of finitude, as the positivities of finitude becomes the foundation for knowledge, right? So there, in this analytic of finitude, in the epistemological process, he identifies three kinds of repetitions. Or otherwise, he says the chapter's title is, I think, Man and His Doubles, the doubles of man, which kind of problematize the human subject itself. So you have three repetitions. The transcendental repeats the empirical, the first one. Second one, the cogito repeats the unthought. Third one, the return of the origin repeats its retreat. So if you look at it, here man appears to be as a fact to be studied empirically, and at the same time becomes the transcendent conditions of the possibility of all knowledge. He becomes the subject of study, and at the same time he becomes the transcendental conditions of the possibility of all knowledge. This is also complicated by the unthought, a Freudian unthought, which evades him constantly. As a unconscious which slips the conscious subject, which kind of doubles the human. And the third one is like while being preserved as the cogito, which is a source of all intelligibility and a product of a receding history in search of an origin while being foundation of that history. So your ontological inquiry regarding your origin, a product of a receding history in search of an origin while being the foundation of that origin. So the man was treated as, I will explain these three repetitions. Human was treated as an empirico-transcendental doublet. At the same time empirical and at the same time the transcendental conditions for the possibility of all knowledge. Empirical subject and a transcendental condition for the possibility of all knowledge, which attempted not to reduce one to other. But the attempt to strike the balance between the empirical and the transcendental approach became a reductive project in which the empirical in man made stand for the transcendental. This congenital problem is further complicated by the doubling of cogito and the unthought as a dimension of our reality. The unthought, which is an otherness that cannot be grasped within the structure of pure consciousness. Here the dichotomy is between man as both an experiencing subject and at the same time never fully understood object of that experience. He is an experienced subject and at the same time he is never fully understood object of that experience because it's a doubled figure wherein which unthought constantly evades that subject. So Foucault, while looking at the phenomenological tradition, argues that the transcendental ego put forward by Husserl is not a resolution of the solution, but the instantiation of man as an empirico-transcendental doublet, as any of these polarities fail to address the opaque unthought and thus harbors the tension between man as a transcendental subject and as an empirical object of study. The unthought, argues Foucault, and the human are contemporaries at the archaeological level, which cannot be completely assimilated into the structures of the cogito. It unfolds the reality of man as an experiencing subject and never fully understood object of that experience. It becomes the other of the man, which is not only a brother, but a twin born not of man, nor in man, but beside him, and at the same time in an identical newness and in an unavoidable duality. I'm quoting Foucault over there. Thus, the modern cogito cannot affirm the being of man as the unthought, which always lies in itself and outside itself, and at its borders, yet also in its warp and woof. So the final problematic which constitutes the doubling of man is in terms of the notion of his origin, which is considered as ever elusive. Well, you look at the origin, or you say the being, the ontological inquiry, being of man, it is considered as an ever elusive inquiry, a remoteness and a distance that constitutes him. This is the constant retreat of the origin. He is posited in the extreme recession of the origin, a primordial temporal, a sort of primordial temporality which is ontologically distant from him whenever he looks at the origin. Thus, in the existential logic, man is doomed to pursue this fruitless project of seeking the loci of his being, and as he fails in his attempt to get back to his origin. All those kind of existential philosophy sort of can be placed there. This analytic of finitude preserved at the core of the search for his essential being or historical origin, and this becomes a transcendental source of the constitution of history, which is imagined ironically in the human consciousness. So in this kind of a historical inquiry, Foucault identifies two streams, which propose a total withdrawal or total return. In Hegel and Marx, the historical inquiry, your question of being, the ontological, the primordial question, is posited is oriented towards the future as the fulfillment of an essential being, or identification of original truth which leads to the end of history. It's like history as the absolute and a small being kind of merges in Hegel, or the communism as a state of liberation in Marx, in that sense. Hegel, in the contrast, the projects of Nietzsche and Heidegger constitute a question of origin or essence as a mere absence, which was present in the past, but it is absent right now. This absence can only be made sense of by becoming aware of what we have lost. So the undue focus on the human for Foucault was nothing other than the new form of dogmatic slumber. Thus, Foucault pronounced the death of the human, and it created a deep void which unfolds many potentialities and new possibilities. The future possibility of a non-human approach is thus articulated by Foucault unfolding the internal consistencies in the construal of anthropos as a central figure of any philosophical engagement. This void created by the disappearance of the human was filled by various other theoretical structures, like Deleuzian philosophy of multiplicity and Latour's actor network theory. I will primarily go to Latour's actor network theory, and then I will go to Deleuzian theory of philosophy of difference. So this is not just a theoretical displacement, but opens up the possibility of a transversal thinking, which becomes the philosophical backdrop to the post-human subjectivity. There is a conceptual similarity between the theoretical structure of Deleuze and Bruno Latour, which can be identified in the virtual possibility of a transversal thinking which is primarily non-human. But while I am combining these are, at the same time, I should specify that these are two distinctive philosophical systems. Not to mention the theoretical complexity of Deleuzian system. Latour's contribution to the non-human centered paradigm is in terms of its object-oriented anthropology that he puts forward. This is not just a mere adaptation of the metaphor of network, but has deep philosophical enquiries embedded in it. The metaphysical structure of Latour is Leibnizian primarily, though he is influenced by an array of philosophers like Spinoza, Whitehead, Serres, and other sociologists like Gabriel Tarde. The philosophical exegesis of objects, which questions the centrality of the human subject, is based on three important concepts. One is actant, second one is network, and third one is translation. So Michel Serres' concept of quasi-object, or quasi-subject as well, is quite central in Latourian framework of actor-network theory. Latour's criticism of traditional critical theory was its focus on the social constructivist perspective on technology, which elides the possibility of exploring technology in terms of its capacity to mediate creatively and operates in unexpected trajectories. The privilege of human being in defining these social relations is clearly attacked in the proposal of actants. The actants of Latour has a philosophical implication, especially in the affinity with the Leibnizian monads, subtractive of the god. Quite similar to the structure of monad, actants are caught in the web of relations facilitated by multitude of interconnections. So Latourian actants are not abstract objects, but objects in action and interaction. So Latour even criticized Heidegger's notion of Dasein, which is an entity being thrown without any relations and thus anomalous, and claims that it is so naked that it does not stand much chance of survival. The actant is so rhizomatic in its operation and undergoes constant changes and creates new line of flight. At the same time, an actant is always unique and cannot be reduced or replaced by another actant. There is an ambiguous position which is attributed to the actant, as there is no clarity possible in terms of a structure or rule being followed, or they are posited outside of all of these. Latour finds the reality in between, in the middle. It is from this process that they engender rules and structures and seek other actors to follow. In short, they mediate between other actants, and in this network of relations, they all undergo change. Even if the actant is not capable of bringing in any change, that cannot be considered as an actant in Latourian sense. The flow, movement, and change are quite integral to the network of relations outlined by Latour. So the network is constituted of actants in interaction without any predetermined rules or laws regulating the movement and flux. The spatiality of the network also cannot be analyzed in traditional terms. The spatiality constituted by the network is not a Euclidean one, as it doesn't offer a confirmed position to the actants in three-dimensional space. It offers a three-dimensional, its arrangement in a three-dimensional space offers a divisible flat surface which is congruent to regionalism. Actor network theory offers actor network theory is against that. Actor network theory offers an alternate spatial arrangement or topology, which is not based on the spatial proximity of objects, but based on the relations and interrelationship between actors. So any entity can be imagined in this way in terms of heterogeneous relationalities than a three-dimensional molar space with conformed positions. The topology completely changes. There's no need for a spatial proximity as such. So this brings a drastic revision in the spatial conception of molar and molecular scales, be it a nation or a city. And an actor network theory, you cannot really conceive it. You look at the telegraph connections and the wires and other things, how this network kind of the spatiality also deconstruct certain concepts like society, social, micro and macro levels of society, etc. Instead, it is about flows, differentials, and fluidity. So as Latour sums up, actors and network, they both designate two phases of the same phenomenon, like waves and particles. The slow realization that social is a certain type of circulation which can travel endlessly without ever encountering either the micro level or the macro level. They are only local, summing up which produce either totalities or total localities. So network, in Latourian sense, is constituted of these heterogeneous connections. So each actant is of different kind and nature. They are all associated in such a way that they make others do things. The action is not triggered by transporting a uniform force from one actant to the another, but by generating transformations in the line of actants which are manifest in unusual and untypical events. This is what Latour terms as the principle of irreduction. Actor network is a concatenation of mediators with a different speciation and dissimilar kinds of force interlinking them. So as we said above, action that is generated between mediators is not transportation of a uniform force, but a transformation which is technically termed as translation. So for Latour, there is no society, no social realm, no social ties, but only translation between mediators that may generate traceable associations. He is also influenced by another philosopher of science, Michel Serres. So Serres' concept of quasi-objects becomes vital to his formulation of actants. What do Serres and Latour means by quasi-objects? As the other side of the coin, quasi-subject. His example of a football game, a ball game, exemplifies this really very well. A ball is nothing but an ordinary object, a particular volume of a big air bubble. Lying just on the ground, it has no meaning, it appears stupid, it has no value, no function, but the game changes its ontology suddenly. Which is, ball is then identified with the collective and circulation, amongst its members. The ball circulates, and in this process, creates the subjectivities of the players. The better the team, the quicker the ball is passed. The ball itself gathers different modes and shades in the passage. Sometimes it becomes slow, it stays with people. Sometimes it becomes quick, it's swerving. Sometimes it acts as if nobody is holding the ball as it is really hot. Sometimes it is passed quickly, other times it playfully sticks around the feet in no mood to leave. The person with the ball is always on the offense, like one with a weapon on the move. The whole defense is organized in relation to him and his position. The ball is the central referential point, and a quasi-object, and as quasi-object, it designates the player on the move. Again, the man of offense, the one with the ball, also becomes the victim. He is the witness, the martyr, as the attention and the aggression of the opposite team is turned on him. Then suddenly the ball just moves away from him, and the witness is no longer there. The ball starts chasing another victim in the network of its passageways. Following Latour questions the dogma of the superiority of human over the non-humans. A taken for granted assumption in this respect is that the techniques are socially constructed while not being specific about the mediation between social actions and what they construct. The more consequential finding is that techniques and technology are only reified social relations. So Latour asks the pertinent question that if artifacts and technology are nothing but social, just delete that. Even while he proposes this theory of object-oriented anthropology, object anthropology, which is directly related with science and technology studies, this has certain drawbacks as well. These drawbacks becomes a possibility of fitting into Deleuze system together. It is an analysis of objects in action only. A dormant object is not an actant for Latour. It is an object in action, actant, something which acts. So outside action and the networks which these objects establish, the ontology of the object remains completely obscure. It is based on the belief that no force is above actants and reality is what is created by the difference stuck up between these actants. So, in short, nothing is known but only realized. If everything becomes an actant, that is another principle which I forgot to mention before. In Latour, everything can become an actant. Anything which acts, whether it be human or non-human, doesn't really matter. Even the privileging of the human is completely attacked when he considers it as kind of a flat ontology where anything can become an actant, whether a rainwater, raindrop, or a cup, or a pin, anything can become an actant, if provided it is being part of the network and becomes an object in action. If everything becomes an actant, the reality becomes a laundry list that might contain anything. A typical set of actants can contain assorted fellow bedfellows like apples, vaccines, subway trains, radio towers, all these things. So here actants suffer from a sort of a tautological weakness. In many instances, it would be difficult to say where an actant starts and where it ends. For example, if my foot is an actant, does it start from the ankle or the heel? If this problem cannot be solved, it would be difficult to distinguish between actants when they are interlinked. So, how a human can be conceived as a unified actant? The person is one actant, is he or she one actant, or a conglomerate of many actants? If the human actant is jogging with its legs, and at the same time hearing music from the iPod with ears, are these all different actants at different levels, or do they have a unity? This again leads back to substance philosophy and Kantianism. So then another question emerges which is related to the network. Is not a network established by actants, another actant created by them? Can a network become an actant? Right? And if networks and actants are the same thing, possessed to the same property, then the theory that an actant gains relative power only through networking with other actants crumbles. Because the actants that are themselves networks could only simply rely on a power that was entirely self-contained or derived from its actant parts. When it comes to a comparison between Latour and Deleuze. Deleuze has an ontology which is quite complicated, much more deeper than Latour. Latour is a more of a flat ontology. There is concerned only about objects in action and the network it creates. What about an object which is not, for example, an object which is not active, but is dormant? Does it have an ontological claim? Deleuze will say yes, right? So one of the most important concept, one of the problems or one of the difference between Latour and Deleuze, in Latour there is no becoming, no time. But there is, in Deleuze, both are very much important. Since objects are individualized in Latour, they do not form assemblages or multiplicity as in Deleuze. On the other hand, they are constituted of independent relations with other objects. So there is nothing like a real substance behind actants for Latour. But for Deleuze, there is something real behind objects, which is not an essence or a substance, but a multiplicity. It is not about essence. Something behind the object is not an essence, but a multiplicity, which constitutes of both virtual and actual properties. So, right now, what I'm going to do is to get into Deleuze. One of the most important problems with Deleuze is the question of difference. He's a differential philosopher of difference, right? So the title of his book, the magnum opus, is titled Difference and Repetition. Two small words, but a heavily loaded philosophical book. What is our normal understanding of difference and repetition? What do you mean by repeat? Why difference and repetition becomes a problem in Deleuze? For Deleuze, the whole history of philosophy, the question of difference and repetition has been subordinated. Why? Difference is always associated with the question of identity, right? You have X differs from Y, right? What it presupposes, any proposition of difference presupposes something what you call an identity. Identity is what? A is equal to A. Something which is there, identical, right? So you presuppose an identity, question of identity. For example, he brings in the question of, he criticized Hegel for that matter. Even though Hegel, there is a becoming. You say thesis, antithesis. It's not purely a question of like a static being philosophy. There is a notion of difference also there. But difference is understood in terms of negation over there. Which is not. X, non-X is a problem for Hegel, right? It is understood in terms of negation. So difference, what you understood, is kind of reduced to the question of negation and also anticipates an identity, even though that identity is a flux, becoming identity in Hegel. Repetition, in the same sense. The question for Deleuze is to kind of liberate difference from the notion of identity, that we call difference in itself, to release difference from the question of identity, right? What is the repetition? Because if you are thinking of difference in terms of identity, then difference is subservient to identity. Without no identical object, without anticipating an identity, we cannot understand difference. For him, difference is something which is generative of identity for Deleuze. Right? We'll come to that. What is a repetition? He starts his preface of difference and repetition, says that a repetition should not be confused with generality. Repetition also has the same problem. When do you see one repeats? When do you say one repeats? Something repeats. It's an exact, identical to the happening of something. Something repeats. What it anticipates is not difference. What it anticipates is the recurrence of the same to repeat. Right? The problem with this notion of difference in terms of identity and repetition in terms of the same, problem for Deleuze is to ask, how can we possibly frame a philosophical structure which can anticipate something new? Where will the new come from? The difference is kind of already stable identities are there. Difference is only difference between stable identities. Whereas repetition is the repetition of the same. The same repeats to reproduce an identity already given. One of the most fundamental problems of philosophy is that of identity and difference. That's one of the most important aspects. And this is a central problem that he kind of addressed in the question of difference and repetition. And difference and repetition, for that matter, becomes one of the most fundamental philosophical texts of Deleuze. I think without which if a grasping of a difference and repetition is there, I think the other later part of Deleuze and Guattari, especially his combination with Guattari, like assemblage, multiplicity, and it becomes more intelligible. The metaphysical grounding of that becoming is laid in Deleuze's difference and repetition. So Deleuze's problem is that difference so far in philosophy is considered as a derivative, it is considered as secondary, it is considered as negative. At the same time, repetition is considered as mechanical, it is considered as external and uncreative. So Deleuze's problem, what if difference were primary and repetition its mode of existence? Repetition becomes the mode of existence of difference. So this philosophy of Deleuze actually kind of goes against the philosophy of representation. In philosophy of representation, mostly the difference is repressed. So normally you say that identity in the concept. So in logic, concepts are defined by predicates. X is A, the cup is white, the cup is small. You have the predicates. To understand is to identify, to subsume individuals under concepts. You have certain things in the room, you will understand it through certain concepts, right? Difference appears only negatively, never positively over there. Not this, not that sort of thing. So identity in the concept. There is some sort of an identitarian principle working in the concept. In Aristotelian logic, the predicates are structured by oppositions. Like it could be, like something could be hot, cold, true, false. So their difference gets reduced to binary oppositions, or it becomes dialectical, a tension between quantities. Another way of addressing difference is in terms of analogy. Sometimes we compare by analogy, simply by proportion. For example, you say that macro and the micro. The macrocosm is kind of reflected in the microcosm, or microcosm reflected in this. It's kind of a superior analogy. It's a difference. The difference is understood in terms of a hierarchical analogy, not just simple pure analogy. So thus also prevents the difference from being thought in itself. It's a kind of a transcendental unity. Then in perception, when you say that in empiricism and natural science, beings are classified by resemblances. For example, genus, species, family resemblances. The classification groups individual by resemblances, reducing the difference to variations within a type, like genus, or for example, genus, species, and all those things. The species anticipates, even though there is a difference over there, Aristotle, there is a clear difference, but the species difference is already anticipates a genus. You have two species in one genus, right? So it always anticipates an identity. So this is what Deleuze would call a dogmatic image of thought. A dogmatic image of thought which allows you to think in terms of stable identities and will not let you to conceive the real difference, the difference in itself, right? You asked the question yesterday, were we post-human already? Yes, we were. We are all post-humans for so much of time. But why we couldn't recognize that? Because we always thought in terms of stable identities. Repetition and difference are always subservient to the notion of identity, stable identities, not fluidity, not multiplicity. Everything what you call difference, which is something which is more prominent in terms of understanding multiplicity, is being attacked, is being killed in favor of an identity principle. So that image of thought that he calls dogmatic image of thought has to be rethought or has to be attacked. This attack on third chapter of Difference and Repetition is all on the dogmatic image of thought, which preserves different forms of stable identities, principles of identities, which is identity, opposition, analogy, and resemblance. So in terms of that, he proposes his positive principles of difference. One is intensity, other is multiplicity, the other one is idea, and then repetition. When we look at this question, I will just go, I won't read anymore. Okay, I will just discuss things. If you are thinking of reality in a Deleuzian framework, normally reality falls into kind of a division between the actual and the virtual. So there are three concepts: real, actual, and the virtual, right? And at the same time, something what you call intensive difference and extensive difference. This comes together. Okay, this is quite integral to understand even the question of difference and repetition. Even though I proposed the question, I never told what Deleuze told about difference and repetition. Right? Deleuze attacked the traditional position of difference and repetition. So what is intensive and extensive? Okay, I will start from there, then I will come to actual and the virtual. If you look at the room that you are sitting right now, from where you are attending this lecture, actually can be divided. It's a space that can be divided. Right? There are certain extensive properties which can be divided. But intensive properties is slightly different, which cannot be divided. Manoj NY gives this example. If you take 100 degrees Celsius water in a gallon, and if you pour it into 2 cups, will it become 45 degrees Celsius? No. This intensive properties also cannot be qualified, cannot be measured in that sense. My favorite example is this. People always, between lovers, there is a question: how much do you love me? If you want to seriously answer that question, you have to be a poet. There is no clear answer for that. Right? It's an intensive thing. It's not an extensive thing which cannot be qualified. So, this intensive realm which cannot be divided Another example of intensive difference and extensive difference is the kind of meteorological, the kind of map that we have of territories and a climate map. Like if you watch the news, you will have a topological map which a lot of pressures and intensities, and then we will say that there will be a tropical rain or something like that. It's a kind of an intensive thing. So what makes this work? There's something what he calls intensive differences, which that he brings in from thermodynamics. So intensive difference is something which becomes the very basic form of fuel in any technological device for us, for anything, for even us. So photosynthesis, for that matter, it is kind of an intensive. Sun becomes a fuel, wherein which there is a transduction. So if you look at thunderstorms, tornadoes, or rains or cloud formations, for that matter, there is a system of difference which produces certain morphogenetic processes. If you look at like a thunderstorm, it's a bounded body of water and air, alive with intensive differences. It creates some sort of a hurricane, or what you call, like in Malayalam, we call it Kadal Chobam, storm surge, right? The angry face of the sea. The sea becomes angry because of certain intensive differences. Intensive and extensive. There are certain intensive differences at work in order to produce a thing. So while you are looking at the reality, if you say that, for example, I will give you a very clear thing. You look at Himalayas. This is again an example given by Deleuze. Himalayas actually grow. You can identify its property by comparing it with Mount Everest or other forms or other things. We can have an extensive evaluation of it, but what you call the extensive thing that you see has an intensive realm of differences, which kinds of folds at the tectonic plates which are in conflict, which kinds of folds and forms the mountain range. So if you think of the Himalayas, the mountain, the actual, it has a virtual aspect to it, and that virtual aspect is composed of these intensive differences, which are in conflict, which actually kind of contributed to the existence of real. So in terms of identifying the real, it splits into the realm of actual and the virtual, right? The actual one have a virtual field of intensive differences. Whatever is actual, if you say Himalaya as an actual thing, which is a morphogenic, it is an independent system in itself. It's kind of folds every year, maybe growing up by millimeters in a year or something. It grows, it folds, and it grows up, right? It has an intensive process behind it. Or it becomes some sort of a but these intensive properties also exhibit certain critical thresholds. So for example, you take water. Water is in terms of like, there are two particular points, critical threshold, which specific singular points where something remarkable happens. You say water, which is at 0 degrees Celsius, it becomes a solid architecture. When it comes to 100 degrees Celsius, it becomes a gaseous architecture, right? Otherwise, in between, it is water. You won't say water at 45 degrees Celsius, water at 50 degrees Celsius or something. There is a particular mode of organization in which water can exist. it is actually mediated by singularities. Extensive properties, singularities is something what is called the 0 degrees Celsius and 100 degrees Celsius. If you say 1 degree Celsius, the water doesn't really change its character, its quality. But if you minus 1 degree from there, it becomes 0 degrees Celsius, it changes its quality, right? And at the same time, if you add 1 degree Celsius to 99 degrees Celsius water, its architecture changes. So there is a change from quality, there is a qualitative change. A quantity of temperature is being added, then there is a change in quality happening. And at the same time, this intensive difference is not just simply because of the speed, it's an intensive thing. For example, he gives this example of a horse walking. A horse at low speed, it walks. It at a critical threshold, it breaks into a trot, right? But breaking into a trot is a qualitative change because the muscles and the other associated organs are connected with it are different. The muscles connected with that movement might become different. And at the same time, if you push it a little further, another critical threshold, it breaks into a gallop. So it uses different muscles and bones in order to trot or walking faster. So there has to be a thinking in terms of this intensive difference, or what you call a critical productive difference, critical threshold, which produces a spontaneous morphogenetic event. So these morphogenetic powers of nature, or you say that artists use critical thresholds in sometimes, right? You know, that is where it becomes, there is a morphogenic process and it becomes different. So the intensive difference is something which makes the actual possibility. So actual possible. So actual cannot be thought without its connection with the virtual in Deleuzian system. So whatever is real, whatever is you are encountering has a virtual aspect to it, and the virtual aspect is composed of these intensive differences. And these intensive differences, this actualization of the virtual, this becoming is called the becoming. You have an intensive realm of possibilities at the virtual realm, which kind of makes the actual possible. Or this is what he calls, he takes the word from Simondon and calls it as individuation. There is no individual as such, there is only individuation. The difference in itself lies at the virtual realm. The intensive difference is what makes the identity possible, or the actual possible. So if you look at an object in terms of an actant, which doesn't really have anything as an essence in it, or a dead object, or not an object which is not in action, in Deleuze it has a virtual intensity. There is a virtual set of possibilities. This is actually not coming from philosophy, it is coming from mathematics. If you look at differential calculus and the other mathematical, I don't know how much time do I have for me to further, if there is anyone, like it's almost 1 hour, I guess.
So you should continue, sir. No problem.
Okay. Is it? So what do you mean by virtual is a structure or space of possibilities. What do you mean by thunderstorm? The intensive difference realm, which they act as the structure of a space of possibilities. Right? That is what you call virtuous. The intensive realm which forms, that is where the becoming happens. How does a becoming happen? It has to have an intensive realm. The virtual becomes the realm wherein which this all its difference in itself lies. Intensive difference lies. So this is coming directly from differential calculus. So what was the differential calculus problem? The instantaneous value of speed at each point. That was their problem. Earlier it was with, in terms of, it is all about a rate of change, speeds of becoming. Right? If I travel from here to the next, if I travel from here to Chennai for that matter, how do you analyze the speed in terms of the time that I take, in terms of dividing the distance by the time taken, you will say the speed. But instantaneous analysis of speed at each point will expose various modes. Like I might slow down, I might go fast, I might stop and do that. So the speed also becomes very important. Sometimes, certain things, the speed at which it happens, we won't even recognize. We have to use a stop photography to kind of do that. Sometimes something can be really slow to be detectable. For example, the folding of the Himalaya is too slow to be detectable. Or the blooming of a flower. We have to use a stop motion photography in order to detect that. So when it comes to differential mathematics, it was posited against something what you call a transcendent coordinates of space, or what we call Cartesian coordinates. This differential mathematics was posited against that. So when you have to identify this instantaneous speed of curvature, the entire field or entire space become a field of rapidities and slowness in that. So they uses the word manifold, n-dimensional space, a field of intensity. Deleuze adapts that word from there, and his notion of multiplicity is coming from the notion of manifold. This Riemannian geometry, which completely revolutionized geometry, is something which is being adapted by Einstein and sort of coming up with a specific theory of relativity.